Hi, my name is Hector Acuna. I'm an artist living in Southeast Wisconsin, and this video is a long overdue final video in my 30 by 30 by 30 YouTube playlist series. So if you haven't watched those videos, I would definitely pause this one to go back and start from the beginning. But in this video, we're going to see the frame building process. So we're over at Home Depot, and we're picking out boards of poplar wood to cut down and make float frames out of. So the first step was to measure the height and the other dimensions of my paintings, so I could do the math and figure out how much lumber I had to cut down and rip into the strips for the outer pieces of my frame. So I'm sort of testing the depth of the wood to make sure that it's a height that I think will work well for the paintings. I definitely wanted to make sure I left a little bit of extra height around the paintings. That way it sort of helps to protect the very delicate surface of egg tempera paintings. So one of the early or first steps was to rip down all of the poplar wood into those skinny outer pieces. So once I did that, I could do a test run for one of the paintings. So that's what we're looking at here. Just making sure that the length and width of my cuts is going to fit around each of the frames the right way. So once I knew the dimensions, I could just start cutting those boards kind of like a machine and assembling them 5 or 6 at a time with my belt clamps. So this is sort of the first batch, and then I'm also showing how I'm going to install my painting. So with the height of the outer piece, I made sure to account for the 1/2-inch thick piece of plywood that the back of the frame will have. And that piece is going to help hold the actual back of the paintings inside the frame. And here at this point, I was still deciding, do I want to paint the frames? Do I want to just do like a clear coat or paint them white or black? Periodically I would just set everything up and look at the paintings in the frames. At some point, I was pausing the woodworking process to write out and design these certificates of authenticity. So I ordered sheets of these from a local print shop that I could eventually fill out and tape to the back of the paintings. And then I was back in the garage. I think all of this was done in early February of 2024. So it was really cold out in the garage, but luckily I was moving around enough to keep warm. Once all of those outer box parts of the frames were assembled, I could start cutting the rest of those 1/2-inch pieces of plywood that go on the sort of shorter sides of the frames, and I could just, glue and air nail them right into the frame. So that was pretty quick. Once that part was done, I could go through and fill in all of those air nail holes with a putty before sanding the frames. Sanding frames is one of my least favorite things to do because it takes forever, and my hands really cramp up from holding the sander and the frames for hours and hours on end. But it's an important step in the process to getting the finish that I really love in the sort of painting process that I use. But this is a look at the poplar frames after they've been sanded all the way through, from 60 grit to 100 grit to 220 grit sandpaper. So after they've been sanded and sort of dusted clean, I can go through and paint all of them by hand with a milk paint. So I'm using a Salem red color of hand mixed milk paint. And the nice thing about that paint is that it's not toxic. So I can do it inside without having to worry about fumes and breathing in harmful chemicals. And then I let all of the frames dry with that paint before hand sanding them with a piece of 220 grit sandpaper. This is also one of my least favorite steps in this finishing process for my frames, but again, you kind of have to do it. So all 30 of these frames get sanded by hand. It's a very dusty process. But once that part is done, if it's warm enough outside, I will then shellac the frames with a spray shellac in my backyard. But in February, it was far too cold to do that step, so I had to go right into the next stages of the finishing process. But before I decided to paint the black layer of paint, I instead wanted to pre-drill and my pilot holes for the screws that go into the back of the frame to hold to the back of the paintings. So that's the step that we're looking at here. So between my two drills, I have like a normal drill bit, and then I have a countersink bit. So the countersink bit just gives the back of the frame a much cleaner look, so that way the head of the screws are flush with the frames, or even slightly embedded into the frames, which I really like. And now we're looking at the second painting step. So now I can go through and cover all of the frames with a layer of black. After researching online, with little information that I could find, there's a finish that I really like in frame making called the Dutch black finish. And it's a combination of casein or bull clay-based paint in this like red, black, two-step layering process. And then with shellac and steel wool, you can get a really nice buffed look to the paint. So that's what we were just looking at there. And then I was testing out the frame in a couple of my different egg temper paintings, just seeing how they were starting to look. I think they turned out really sharp. I like the really limited color palette and the way that the warm kind of raw umber chocolatey palette of the paintings really matches that warm undertone to the frames. A lot of these paintings, by the way, are still available through my website. So if you're interested in any of them, they're $200. Probably at this point, 25 or so are available, and you can find them over on my website, akunaarts.com. This is a closer look at the steel wool sort of burnishing part of the painting process. This is one of the final stages of finishing the frames. You can see a pre-burnished frame next to the finished one there. And you can really see the difference once the frame has been burnished. Part of that steel wool process that's a little bit annoying is that it just disintegrates as you're burnishing the frame. So I have to constantly go through and make sure that I'm vacuuming up all those little bits and pieces of steel wool. But then the frames are pretty much done, and I could start installing the paintings and filling out my certificates of authenticity. So I hand sign and number each of these little certificates that will then be attached to the back of the frames. And here's a quick look at all of them after they've been assembled. It's really satisfying to see months of work sort of finalized at this last point in the process. So the next step then is to add my hanging hardware. So I've got this little box full of hanging hardware that I buy in bulk. It's a lot cheaper that way. I also had these little felt pads to put down in the corners of each of the frames. And then it was time to start packaging all of the frames and paintings and getting them ready to be delivered to the gallery in time for the show in April of 2024. So I'm really glad that I made this video. Sorry it took so long and I forgot about it, but it was a great experience from start to finish, and I'm glad that I made sure to document and share the process with you. That's the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you in a future video. Take care, everyone. Bye.